back to another exciting episode here at IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Wes Bryan, and in today's episode, we're continuing through our series in VMware. That's right, we're coming back at you with some more VMware Certified Professional, and believe it or not, this is actually a part 3 on creating virtual machines. So we won't waste any time here. Joining me in the studios is none other than Mr. Don Pezet. Don, how you doing, sir?
I'm doing great, Wes. If I could just stop rambling so much about virtual machines. I'm excited to jump back into this and get to some of the things that I tried to wrap up in the last episode, but we talked a lot about the VMware tools in the last episode, and we just didn't actually get them installed. So I want to show you guys that process, get some of the tools installed, and show you how it works. And then we've got a few other VM options that we need to configure too. So let's just kick it off there. I had been working with 2 virtual machines in the show. I've got these WebO1 and DBO1. These 2 guys, they're both CentOS boxes. I think CentOS 6, if I remember right. And they're both up. I've got them installed, but I just installed the base OS. I never actually installed the VMware tools on them. And as a result, I'm missing some functionality. So for example, if I take WebO1 here and I go into the options and take a look at the VMware tools settings, a lot of that stuff will be grayed out in there because, well, they're not installed. And what I highlighted in the last episode was if I tried to take a snapshot, when I take a snapshot of it, there's an option right here to quiesce the guest file system where I can get it to quiet down, slow down all the writes to the hard drive so I can take a good, clean snapshot of the hard drive and then start writing again. That right now my VMware tools are not installed, and so I can't do that. I can't quiesce the hard drive. So if I want to do those things, I'm going to need to install the virtual machine editions. And if you're looking at like the getting started page for your virtual machine, when you create a virtual machine, it actually tells us in here some of the different things you might want to do, and it's got learn how to install a guest operating system, and if we go into those documents, it actually talks about installing the VMware tools and getting them in place. But it is one of the first steps that we need to do to get the machine up and healthy. Now, if you don't know if your machine has the VMware tools already or not, the Summary tab is a great place to find it. You can click on your virtual machine, go to the Summary tab, and up in the Summary, you'll see right here, VMware tools, and then you're going to see one of 2 things. Either that it's not running and not installed like mine, or the version of the VMware tools, because the version can get out of date too and you might need to update them. So that's another thing that you'll see there. So mine's up, but it doesn't have VMware tools. Now, installing the VMware tools is really easy. If you haven't done it, you'll have this nice big warning right here, VMware tools not installed in the virtual machine, and you can click this link to install the VMware tools. All right, so it's as easy as clicking a link. What's it actually doing though? When you click the link, what it's really doing is taking an ISO image that has the VMware tools and it's putting it into the virtual machine to start the install. It actually can't do the install for you though. So you still have to log into the virtual machine and go and do it, but it can kick off the process, right? So if I were to click that, it's going to tell me that it's going to mount the CD, it's going to put that into the operating system, and then we'd need to start it and get it running, right? So it's just telling me that they can do that, and I can hit mount. Now when I hit mount, it will actually try to launch the installer, and sometimes like if you have auto run turned on in Windows, it might actually be able to run the installer, but other times it's just going to pop that disk in there and then it's going to sit. All right, so what did it really do? Well, let me make sure it's actually done attempting. It is good. All right, what it really did is put that CD in. So if I go to Manage and Settings, and I go to my virtual machine hardware, I can look at the CD DVD drive, and if I expand that out, see what it mounted? It mounted a file called linux.iso, right? That's an ISO image of the VMware tools for Linux, and it's got ISO images for all sorts of different OSs baked into it. If we edit this, and I go down to that same CD drive, I can see the file that it picked right here. If I hit Browse and browse my data stores, you'll notice a data store here called VM Images. I didn't make that. That's a part of ESXi. Every ESXi box that you set up will have this VM Images data store. And if you browse inside of it, that's where it's got the tools-ISO images. And it's got ISO images for all the various operating systems that VMware supports. So we'll see Windows, Windows pre-2000. Actually, these are the signature files, so I need these guys here, the ISOs. I've got FreeBSD, Linux, a handful of others. There's NetWare, Windows, Darwin. Darwin is Mac OS, right? So OS 10. Solaris. So I'm seeing each of the different ones that we support. I've got a Linux box, so that's the one that I want. But if this was a Windows machine, I'd want the Windows ISO, and it's got the tools there. Now, Windows is not a lot of fun on this one because there's a little setup.exe file, you double click it and you click next 3 times and you're done. So it's like the least exciting install possible. But on the Linux side, VMware doesn't know whether you even have a graphical user interface at all. So can they give us a GUI tool if they don't even know you'll have a GUI? No, we've got a command line tool. We've got a shell script that we can run that'll install those. And so that's what I've got here on this machine, is that ISO image is mounted, and now we can go and we can install it. So I've got Web01 pulled up here in my console, and just for my own curiosity, it is CentOS 6.7. So that's the latest version of the 6 string, but CentOS 7 is out. CentOS 7 actually has the VMware tools baked into it, so there's not a lot of need to install it. CentOS 6.7, it might have the VMware tools. So easy way to find out is try and install them again. If it gives us trouble, then we'll know. All right, now the hardest part about Linux is each distribution handles mounted media different. Some distributions like Ubuntu will mount the CD for you automatically and you don't have to worry about it. Other ones like CentOS a lot of times will make you mount it. So I'm just going to run the mount command and see if it already mounted my CD drive. And I'm just going to look through everything that it mounted here, and yeah, it didn't mount my CD drive for me. So I need to get it mounted. So I'm going to make a folder to mount that to. And I'll just do like /mnt/cd-rom. You can do wherever you want, right? But that's where I'm going to mount it to. So I'm going to mount /dev/cd-rom to /mnt/cd-rom. And there it goes. All right, so now that I've got that mounted, I can switch over into that folder, and we can take a look at what's in it. And what we're going to see are a couple of files. These are the actual VMware Tools files. And the main file that I care about is VMware Tools -10.0.6-3560309.tar.gz. Rolls right off the tongue. That is a tar, a tape archive, and a gzip. It's GNU zipped and compressed. That's got all the VMware tools in it. And that's the file that I really want. There's other files in here. You'll notice these other programs, the upgraders. If I've already got the VMware tools installed, I can just run the upgrade script, and that'll take care of me. I don't have it installed yet, though, so I need the actual installer. Now, it is archived, and I'm on a CD drive that's read-only. You probably saw that little mounting message up above there. So I need to copy that to my home directory so I can work with it. So I'm just going to copy that file, and I'm going to send that right over to my home directory. And once it's in my home directory, now I'll be able to work with it right here. In fact, I don't need the CD drive anymore. I can get rid of that, and so that's gone. And now I've got that archive right here in my home directory. I need to extract it and get all the files out of it. Now it's a tar.gz. That means it's tarred and it's gzipped, and so I need to undo both. Fortunately, I can do that with the tar command. So I'm going to use tar, and I'll say X for extract, V for verbose so that I can see it happening, Z saying unzip it, right? Ungzip it, and then F to tell it the file that I want to use, and then I can give it that file name. And when I run this, we're going to see a lot of stuff scroll by, and that's it extracting the VMware tools for me so that I'll be able to do the install. So that's just going to ramble on by real quick. It is creating a subfolder for me, and what I need will be right in there. And there'll be an install script that's suitable for doing the first installation of VMware tools on a machine. All right, so that's going to take just a moment while it extracts all those files. Then as soon as it's done, we'll be able to get to the installer, and there we go, it's finished. So we can look, and it's actually going to create a folder, and it'll probably be hard to see because it's dark blue on black, but it created a folder called VMware Tools Distrib, or distribution. And if I get into that folder, I'll see the actual install file that I want, vmware-install.pl, right? It's a little Perl script. That's what's going to install the VMware tools. And if I call that script, that's going to start the installer. And I know on the Windows server how I said you just click next 3 times. Well, on the Linux box, it is a script, and it's basically press enter 15 times. It's going to give you a bunch of options, and you can override them if you want, but for the most part, we just want to accept the defaults. The first one is, where do we want to install the binary files to? And /usr/bin, that's as good a place as any for this, but you could choose to override it and put it in sbin or wherever. Which directory contains the init for initialization files? On a startup system like this, it's /etc/rc.d, and I don't want to deviate from that. Then we've got the init scripts, which are in initd. We'll leave that at the default. For the daemon files, those are going to go into sbin. I'll accept the default there. And then the library files, these are kind of the important ones. These are the drivers themselves in /user/lib/VMware tools. And now it's just going to say that doesn't exist. Are we sure we want to do it? And I'll say yes. Literally, I'm just hitting enter over and over again here. You don't even need to pay somebody more than minimum wage for this. Just pressing enter over and over. But if we want to change them, we have that option, okay? So when it does that, it's going to go and create that folder and start to copy files. Now, you do need to be root to do this, right? I'm already root. I'm breaking security rules and logging in as root. If I wasn't root, I'd be getting errors here. So I need to use the sudo command when I call that Perl script to make sure that I've got it. So that's the last there for its agent, its transient files, and that should be about it. Oh, we got documentation. So it wants to copy the documentation somewhere. We'll let that go. And now it's offering whether or not we want to invoke the VMware tools for the first time, right? And you probably do. You went through the trouble to install it, so you might as well go ahead and run it. And that's going to get that final thing up, and now it's initializing the tools, and we'll have the VMware tools up and running on our system, okay? Once that's done, what you might see is your virtual machine might lose network connectivity for a moment and then wake back up as it loads the network drivers. Your network config might get broken because the config file before might have been tied to Ethernet 0, and now it's instead of like EM0, it becomes VM0 or something. You know, your interface name might change. So you might need to go and tweak some settings there if needed be. Now it's going to get into some optional stuff. In Windows, you always have a GUI, and so there's GUI tools like dragging and dropping files between your desktop and the console of a virtual machine. In Linux, you don't always have a GUI. So the next couple of questions are just asking me whether I want to install the GUI utilities. I don't have a graphical user interface on this system, so I'm going to say no to these, and that is the default. So I'm just going to accept that. So just doing no for dragging and dropping and so on. And then after that, we've got guest authentication with our environment, which we want because we have vCenter single sign-on, so we'll accept the defaults on those. And now it's bothering to tell me that it didn't find X Windows, which is the GUI, and that's okay. So at this point, we should be pretty good to go. I didn't have to be an expert on this stuff. Really, you just press enter a bunch of times and it installs it. And once it's done, now we can interact with the ESXi box.
Now, Don, you've talked about some of the options that are available with VMware tools. In fact, we've seen a couple here in the CLI. Are there additional options?
There are. Once it's done, once the tools actually started, mine's still kind of activating itself, and then it'll probably need to reboot afterwards. But once it's done, that's when we jump back to our GUI. And in our GUI, what we'll see is that, actually there, so mine did just finish, right? So we get the thank you from the VMware team, and they're telling me it's done. I can unmount the CD-ROM drive if I'm not using it anymore, so I can get rid of that. And so now we're good to go. You can even delete the install files that were copied. But now that it's done, our graphical interface for vCenter should recognize that the tools are installed, and we can see it. Now, I have seen sometimes where I had to reboot the virtual machine before that worked. Let's see if that happens this time. I don't know if it will. Let me get out of full screen here and jump back over to vCenter. And on vCenter, my machine shows VMware tools install in progress. Okay, I'm just going to refresh that one time and see if that changes. And if it doesn't, I might need to reboot. And well, mine says VMware tools upgrade in progress. That's a little different, right? So it's trying to get that sorted out. It's populating with more information than it did before, right? Like it sees the IP address of the guest, which it didn't see before. So it is getting a little more information, which means the VMware tools are working. They may just not be done yet, and so I'm going to refresh. What happens is once they start talking to the host can actually update it if there's newer versions. There shouldn't be any newer versions for me because I just installed the darn thing. So it should be okay. If that upgrade stays, which mine is saying upgrading, then it's probably a good idea to reboot the virtual machine. Now, assuming the tools are installed, I should be able to gracefully restart the VM. If the tools weren't installed, you could right-click the VM, you could go to Power, and under Power, you could just power off. But what that's going to do, it's going to yank the power plug out of it. But see how I've got shut down guest OS or restart guest OS? That's graceful. It's going to reach out to the guest OS and say, hey, could you please restart? And then it will restart on its own, and that's what we want, and that's part of what VMware Tools gets us, right? And you'll see other options like the guest OS options here. We can unmount the VMware Tools installer. Now it's actually able to talk with that guest a little bit. So I'm going to give this a shot here. I'm going to go to Power and restart guest OS and see if that works. And, if I had taken the time to read that message, it was actually telling me that it wasn't able to do the restart. Oh, but it did it. Yeah, that was a graceful shutdown. I saw the Linux stuff kind of churning along there. It did the graceful restart. So once this is done, I'm now going to have my full VMware Tools functionality, but definitely something to check. But that's not what you asked, Wes. I kind of got sidetracked because you asked if there were other options, right? Now that the tools are installed, once they get detected here, Now I'll be able to start tweaking those settings so that if I go into my virtual machine and I go to Manage, VM Options, and VMware Tools, these will actually mean something now. So when I come in here to VMware Tools, let's see, VM Options, VMware Tools, now I'll be able to adjust these settings to mean something. See how some of these, the power operations, I still can't choose, and that's because the system is still rebooting, the tools aren't fully loaded, and same thing with these other options, but I'll be able to start checking those and getting them set. I can tell it to check for upgrades, and those will start to work. So that's pretty much it on the VMware Tools side. But you'll notice there's a lot of other stuff in here that's not necessarily VMware Tools related. So like the power management options up here, the remote console options and general options, all of these other things, these are related to the advanced configuration of the virtual machines. And let's run through some of these because I know a lot of them aren't necessarily super popular. Some of them make a lot of sense, right? Like here, VMware remote console options. Actually, I'm going to edit this so we get the edit screen. It's a little easier to see on the edit screen. So when I go here under VM options and we take a look at it, the VMware remote console, all right? See how it says lock the guest operating system when the last remote user disconnects. If you've got people remotely connecting to the virtual machine, what's the first thing they're going to do? They're going to unlock the screen or log in with their user account and start to work with it. Well, if they disconnect, what happens to the next person who connects to the console? Console's already logged in. Logged in as a different user. And so you can tell it, hey, when somebody connects, if the last person disconnects, go ahead and lock the screen. That way when somebody else remotely connects, they'll see the lock screen and they'll have to authenticate, either as themselves or as a user with sufficient permissions to kick off the other people. So we can turn that on. But that only works if the VMware tools are installed. Mine are still loading, so it's all grayed out for me. Then you've got power management. All right? Power management says if we shut down the host operating system, or if the host operating system goes into standby, what happens to the guest? Does the guest go into standby also, or do we suspend the virtual machine, take its RAM, write it to hard drive, and power it off, right? So I can choose between those different behaviors. We've got boot options. When the virtual machine boots up, what does it do? And the default is it's going to be using its own little BIOS. We saw the NVRAM file earlier. And then is there a boot delay? Why would I want a boot delay? All right, well, let's say that I've got 15 guests on this one host, and I have them all set to automatically start up. When I power on that host, I'm gonna have 15 machines all trying to boot at the same time. That's a lot of disk I/O. Servers rarely generate more disk I/O than they do during boot time. So I might set a delay and say, for example, I want these 3 servers to power on immediately. These other 3 servers boot up after 1 minute. These other servers boot up after 5 minutes. And that can kind of stagger that boot process. You can set a delay on that virtual machine to start up and make it a little less disk intensive. We can force BIOS setup, which basically makes you do the hardware detection every time it boots, where it looks for how much memory you have and what disks are present. I don't know exactly why you would do that. I guess if you wanted to get into the BIOS, it's next to impossible to hit delete on your keyboard while it's booting because VMs boot so fast. So this would force us to get into BIOS and not have to worry about hitting a hotkey real quick while it booted. Failed boot recovery. If it crashes during boot, if it doesn't come up, what do? Do we just try and reboot it? Right? We can turn that on. The default is it just locks up and that's it. And that may be better for us because now we can see the error versus it just sitting there continually trying to boot. Then as we dig down a little deeper, there's one last option for Fiber Channel NPIV, and you'll see where we can expand that and we can turn it on or off if we want to use NPIV.
Now, I've been following you up until this point, Don. Most of these seem fairly straightforward, but I can't even say the acronym here. NPIV, what is that?
All right, we talk about Fiber Channel in this series. We really don't dive into it. In the Fiber Channel world, Fiber Channel switches identify nodes on the network by assigning them what's called an N port. It's N_port, which I guess they don't really write here on the screen anywhere, do they? But anyhow, it's called an N port, and it basically stands for a node. One node is plugged into one port. If you think about a physical switch, you have one computer plugged into one port. But with NPIV, what you can do is you can have a virtual machine that sees the SAN, that connects directly to the SAN. So a virtual machine, instead of connecting to a VMDK, a virtual hard drive, it could connect to the SAN itself. We do that when we want high disk I/O, right? Well, the problem there is your host is what's plugged into the SAN, not the virtual machine. So when you have the virtual machine reaching out to the SAN and you have the host reaching out to the SAN, technically you've got 2 different nodes on the same port, which is not normally allowed, right? NPIV allows that. NPIV is the N port, or node port, identity or ID virtualization. I kind of screwed that all up, didn't I? Endport ID virtualization. That's what it stands for. But endport is short for node, and ID is short for identity. So if we wanted to go all out, it would be node port identity virtualization. So that's what NPIV is. And if you turn it on, you can define the worldwide names that are going to be allowed to be shown on this link to the switch. And the switch will see that and recognize that, yeah, I got more than one node on the same interface. That's not allowed by a lot of fiber switches, so we have to turn that support on. So that's what NPIV is, and you've got that setting right here. If you don't have a fiber channel SAN, this is useless to you. You don't have to worry about it. Even if you do have a fiber channel SAN, if you've got a fiber channel SAN, but your VMs are just using regular VMDK stored in a data store, then this doesn't matter to you. This really only matters when we're directly exposing SAN drives to the VM. So basically the VM is bypassing the host OS and going straight to the SAN itself. That's where NPIV comes in. So most people haven't worked with it. I'm not surprised that you haven't heard that one, Wes, and it's just one of the advanced options that we've got in here that we might need to tweak. And it certainly could turn up on the exam, so it's good to know what that is. All right, so we've got our VMware tools installed. We've seen some of the advanced options that we can tweak in here. There are a few other things that we'll see later on. I'm curious to see if my VMware tools ever did complete, or if it still shows upgrade in progress. I wonder what the heck it thinks it's upgrading. But the VMware tools are working. We saw I was able to do that graceful shutdown, which was nice. And I should be able to do quiesced snapshots now, assuming that that's working. So if I go and take a snapshot, no, it's still not showing, so my VMware tools aren't fully installed. So this is a good way to recognize that I've got a problem, right? There's something wrong with my VMware tools, and so I'll need to go in and try and figure out what's going on there, why those two aren't talking. I did restart my virtual machine, but I did a hot restart. I might need to do a cold restart where I actually shut it down. Sometimes when you do a hot restart, it just doesn't reinitialize those communications, and so that would be kind of my next step, is to come in here and, again, try and do a graceful shutdown of the OS. So I'm going to gracefully shut down that web server, and there it goes. It just kicked me out of my console. And then start it back up again and let those run. And this way, if there's a problem with the VMware tools, we'll see it in the logs when it boots up. So that machine's now turned off, and I can come back and start it again if I can get into the right menu. And it'll boot up, and hopefully we'll see those VMware tools clean themselves up. And see how the VMware tools show is not running right now? But it does show version 10246. So it is seeing the tools, it is communicating, it just got stuck in some kind of upgrade loop. So we'll let that reboot and see if it gets happy. But once the tools are installed, they're mostly maintenance free. In fact, as long as you choose the upgrade options, right, which we saw where we could set that to automatically upgrade, then you usually don't have to worry about the tools ever again. They're just in place and they run, but you definitely want them. All right, well, Wes, on my notes here, I wanted to talk about vApps, and I wanted to talk about clones and templates, but we might need to move that into another episode. Let's not do a part 4 on this one, because I think a trilogy is enough. But know that once you've created your virtual machines, everything we saw in the last 3 episodes is really all we need to create a virtual machine and get it up and going. But there's a few other time-saving techniques that we can use. There's virtual apps that we're going to learn about where we can group virtual machines together. And there's cloning and templating, which we can use to really quickly deploy out VMs. So we're going to talk about those two. They're completely optional. You don't have to use vApps. You don't have to use clones and templates at all. And you have full functionality of your VMs, everything we saw in the last 3 episodes. But boy, is it nice to be able to have these time-saving tools. So we're going to see those in another episode. Definitely stay tuned for that one.
I was going to say, I don't want to sit here and state the obvious because you guys can't see off camera over there giving Don the evil eye saying, oh, the clock, we got to wrap this one up. And that looks like what we're going to do here, Don. But before we do you got any additional information when it comes to creating your virtual machines or even the VMware tools in general?
Just make sure they do work. Mine actually are working now, so I can see that my VMware tools are showing as running version 10.246 current. So don't just install them and assume they work. Double check. Make sure they actually show as running inside of the vCenter console, because otherwise they may not be fully working, and test it out. Make sure you can do that graceful shutdown. But once the tools are in place, you don't have to worry about it. Be careful, because some distros, like Ubuntu, are now starting to package in the VMware tools with the distro, so you don't necessarily need to install them. Bring it up inside of vCenter and see if it shows up. They may already be clean, so don't assume that you just have to go in there and install it.
Well, Don, we do appreciate you showing us that patience is a virtue, and we also appreciate you being in the studios with us, and we appreciate you, the viewer, watching. Signing out for IT Pro TV, I've been your host, Wes Bryan.
And I'm Don Pizzette.
We'll see you next time.